I am Michaela Franklin, 22 years old, and I'm the CEO of a $50 million company my family thinks doesn't exist. Last Christmas, they forced me to babysit their kids while they went to the mayor's gala. My sister, Simone, threw $40 at me for pizza. When I told her I had a college final that night, she laughed and threatened to cut off my tuition fund. So I walked out. What she didn't know was that her punishment was the exact key I needed to unlock my real 8-figure inheritance. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been the one in the family who was dangerously underestimated. It was Christmas Eve. The air in our Buckhead mansion wasn't filled with holiday cheer. It was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and quiet tension. My father, Marcus, was adjusting his cufflinks, his tuxedo sharp and imposing. My mother, Denise, was fastening a diamond necklace, her sequined dress shimmering under the chandelier. And then there was my sister, Simone, 30 years old and the golden child of the Franklin family. She was checking her reflection in the grand hall mirror, looking like a movie star in her emerald green gown. Her husband, Chad, a finance guy from a family with the right connections, stood beside her, sipping a scotch. I, on the other hand, was invisible. Or at least, I was supposed to be. At 20 years old, I was in the corner, trying to stop Simone's 2-year-old from drawing on the wall with a candy cane, while 3 of my cousins ran screaming around the Christmas tree. My uniform, as always, was a pair of worn-out jeans and a college hoodie stained with what I hoped was cookie dough. Simone finally turned, pulling her attention away from her own reflection. She walked over and pulled a few crumpled bills from her tiny designer clutch. "Here's $40, she said, not meeting my eyes. "Call for pizza for the kids, and try to keep them out of the main living room. Don't let them destroy the place before our guests arrive tomorrow." I didn't take the money. My hands felt cold. "I can't tonight, Simone." She finally looked at me, her perfectly plucked eyebrow raising in annoyance. "What do you mean you can't? It's babysitting. It's what you do." "I have my final presentation," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "It's online at 8 o'clock. It determines my scholarship." Before Simone could even respond, her husband, Chad, let out a short, barking laugh. "A presentation? For that silly community college you go to?" He swirled his drink, the ice clinking. "Michaela, this is the real world. Your parents are attending the mayor's charity gala. This is about business, about networking. That's a little more important than some 2-bit class project." I looked past him to my mother, hoping for backup. There was none. "Michaela, don't be so difficult," Denise said, her voice smooth and placating, the one she always used when she was siding with Simone. "Your sister has had this night planned for months. It's important for your father's business. It's your duty as part of this family to help out." "My duty is to my future," I said, my voice shaking slightly but gaining strength. "This presentation isn't just a project. It decides my scholarship. It's my only way to transfer to a 4-year university." This wasn't the first time my future had been treated as an inconvenience. A sharp memory flooded back to me. I was 16, in my only formal dress, waiting for my date for the winter formal. Simone had a minor cold. My parents insisted I stay home to watch her, just in case. I spent that night listening to my sister complain about her sniffles while I cried silently in the hallway, my corsage wilting on the counter. I was always the free babysitter, the built-in sacrifice. Simone's perfect smile vanished, replaced by a cold fury. "Scholarship," she scoffed. "Where exactly do you think you're going with that pathetic degree?" "Fine. You want to choose it over this family? Good." She turned, not to me, but to our parents, her voice rising with authority. "Mom, Dad, I told you this would happen. I am the manager of Grandad Isaiah's Family Education Fund. And I'm telling you, if she dares open that laptop tonight, If she chooses that silly presentation over her responsibility, that fund is closed. Permanently. She looked back at me, her eyes glinting. You will not get another cent for school. Ever. My blood ran cold. I looked at my parents, my heart pounding, pleading with my eyes for them to step in, to say something. This was my education. My father, Marcus, adjusted his bow tie. He cleared his throat. Simone has a point, Michaela. You need to learn how to prioritize this family. My mother, Denise, smoothed the front of her gown, avoiding my gaze. Don't ruin everyone's lovely evening with this drama, dear. Just do as your sister says. It was a betrayal so complete, so absolute, that it didn't even hurt. It was clarifying. I looked at Simone, at her smug, victorious expression. I looked at my parents, already turning toward the door, their minds on the gala, on appearances, on anything but me. I finally understood. I wasn't part of their family. I was just a tool they used. I understand, I said. My voice was suddenly calm, steady. All the shaking was gone. I untied the apron, its fabric still sticky with cookie dough, and folded it neatly. I placed it on the polished marble counter. Then I pulled the house key from my pocket and placed it quietly on top of the apron. I'm done. I turned and walked out the front door. I didn't grab a coat. I didn't look back as I heard my mother gasp, "Michaela, what are you doing?" I just kept walking down the long brick pathway. The last thing I heard before the heavy oak door slammed shut was Simone's furious scream echoing into the cold night air. "Go on! Walk out! You'll be back! You'll come crawling back begging for scraps, you ungrateful little dropout!" I ran from that house. I didn't even grab a coat. The cold Atlanta air hit my face, but I felt numb, clutching my laptop bag like it was a shield. While my family was stepping out of a Bentley onto a red carpet, I was swiping my bus pass, my hands shaking so hard I dropped it twice. The bus ride felt like an eternity. I watched the mansions of Buckhead fade into the fluorescent-lit streets of the city, every second feeling Simone's threat like a vice around my neck. I sprinted onto the Atlanta Community College campus at 7:58. My final presentation was at 8. I burst into the classroom, my lungs burning. My professor, Mrs. Gable, looked up with a severe frown. "Ms. Franklin, just in time. The panel is waiting." The guest judges looked tired. They had been listening to presentations for hours. My hands shook as I plugged my laptop into the projector. I could hear Simone's voice in my head. "Ungrateful little dropout." I took one deep, ragged breath. I am not a dropout. "Good evening," I started, my voice trembling. My project is called Beacon. It's a scalable fintech solution." I clicked to the first slide. "Our community banks are dying," I said, my voice suddenly finding its rhythm. "They are being suffocated by the big corporate chains, not because they offer worse service, but because they lack the technology to compete. They can't afford the mobile platforms that customers now demand." The idea was painfully personal. I remember the summer I interned for free at my father's company, Marcus Bank. I saw the chaos firsthand. The aging systems, the security flaws, the complete inability to serve anyone under 40. I spent weeks developing a proposal, a simple plan to update their mobile services. When I finally got 5 minutes with my brother-in-law, Chad, who was the chief operating officer, he didn't even look at my report. He just smiled, patting my head. "That's cute, Michaela. Now be a doll and get me a coffee, Black." That memory erased my fear. My voice stopped shaking. It became cold, precise. "Beacon isn't just an app," I said, looking directly at the judges. "It's a lifeline. It provides enterprise-level security, seamless mobile integration, and AI-driven financial literacy tools, all at a cost that community banks can actually afford. It's not just about saving banks. It's about saving neighborhoods." I finished. The room was silent. My professor looked stunned. The judges began to clap, politely at first, then with more energy. As I gathered my things, ready to face the fact that I was now homeless, a deep voice cut through the noise. "Ms. Franklin, a moment." I turned. It was the guest judge I hadn't recognized. He was an older, impeccably dressed African-American man, probably around 60, with eyes that seemed to see everything. He radiated a quiet power. He stood up and walked toward me, extending his hand. "I am Dr. Elias Vance. Your presentation on fintech infrastructure was truly impressive. But I must admit, I'm even more impressed by your name. Are you by any chance related to Isaiah Franklin?" "He was my grandfather," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. Dr. Vance's serious expression broke into a warm, sudden smile. "I know," he said, his eyes crinkling. "Isaiah was my best friend. And he knew his son, your father Marcus, was a pompous fool who only cared about appearances." I stared at him, completely stunned. My family had always spoken of my grandfather Isaiah as a distant, traditional patriarch. They never mentioned his friends. "You knew him?" "Knew him? Michaela, I was the best man at his wedding. We built our first businesses together, and for the last 10 years of his life, he worried about one thing more than any other. He worried about you." He guided me to a chair, his entire demeanor shifting from that of a guest judge to one of urgent importance. "Michaela, what did your family tell you about your grandfather's will?" "Just the family education fund," I said. "My sister Simone controls it. She just cut me off tonight. That's why I was almost late. She threatened to cut me off if I didn't babysit, so I left." Dr. Vance listened, nodding slowly. "She threatened you with that fund?" He let out a short, dry laugh. "Isaiah was a brilliant man. He saw this coming from a mile away." He leaned forward, his voice low and serious. "The family education fund Simone controls is a decoy, Michaela. It's a small, secondary account he set up to keep your parents and sister busy, to make them feel like they were in control of his legacy." My heart hammered against my ribs. "What are you talking about?" "The real inheritance," he said, pausing for effect, "is a separate, private trust. One that Isaiah established only for you. It's substantially larger, and he made me the executor." I couldn't process the words. "A private trust? For me? Why wouldn't they just give it to me?" "Because Isaiah knew them," Dr. Vance said, his voice hardening. "He knew your parents would always prioritize Simone, their golden child. He knew they would use his money as a weapon to control you, just like they did tonight. So he set up the trust with two very specific conditions for its activation." He held up one finger. "1. The trust would activate if your family officially refused to support your higher education, forcing you to find your own way." He held up a second finger. "Or 2. It would activate the moment you, on your own, demonstrated the very capability and vision that he always knew you had." He smiled, a look of profound satisfaction on his face. "Tonight, Michaela, in your desperation, you didn't just meet one of those conditions. You fulfilled both of them." Dr. Vance didn't take me back to the classroom. He guided me to a quiet faculty lounge, his hand gently on my shoulder. He opened his briefcase and slid a thick, leather-bound folder across the polished table. "This is the executive summary of the Isaiah Franklin Private Trust," he said. His voice was soft, but the words landed like thunder. "Your grandfather was a very wealthy man, Michaela, but he was discreet. He set this aside exclusively for you. The total value, liquid, is $5 million, with additional investments valued at roughly 3 more. I stopped breathing. $5 million. My mind couldn't process the number. That was more money than my entire family, with their flashy cars and Buckhead mansion, probably had in disposable cash. My first thought flashed instantly to Simone. I could see her smug face. I could enroll at Harvard tomorrow. I could buy a penthouse in her building. I could get a law degree just to spite her. The temptation was overwhelming, a wave of vindication that made me dizzy. I could finally win their toxic game. Then I looked down at my worn laptop bag, the bag containing my beacon project. I thought about Chad's mocking laugh. A silly community college. I thought about my father's dismissal. No, I said. The word came out quiet, but it was solid. Dr. Vance looked at me, intrigued. No? I don't want Harvard, I said, zipping my laptop bag with a decisive pull. I don't want to buy a fancy degree just to show them. That's their game. I want to build this. I tapped the bag. I want to build Beacon. For a moment, Dr. Vance just stared at me. Then he broke into a loud, joyous laugh that echoed in the empty lounge. That's her, he boomed, clapping his hands together. That's Isaiah's granddaughter, right there. He wiped a tear from his eye. He knew you'd say that. He was praying you would. He reached back into his briefcase, which is why he left these. He handed me 2 more items. The first was a thick, cream-colored envelope. My name was written on the front in my grandfather's unmistakable, elegant script. The second was a heavy legal document, bound and sealed by a law firm I didn't recognize. Isaiah was a sentimental man, but he was not a fool, Dr. Vance said, his voice dropping. He knew your father was reckless. He knew Marcus Bank was vulnerable years ago, long before Chad ever got his hands on it. I looked at the legal documents. My brow furrowed in confusion. I don't understand. What is this? That, Dr. Vance said, is a portfolio of debt. Your grandfather knew Marcus was over-leveraged. So, quietly, through a third-party holding company, Isaiah bought up a significant portion of Marcus Bank's unsecured corporate debt. He leaned in, and the final, devastating hook landed. In other words, Michaela, you don't just have $5 million in startup money. As of this moment, you are one of the primary creditors for your own family's bank. I didn't go back to that house. I couldn't. Instead, Dr. Vance took me to a quiet hotel for the night. We spent the next 2 days making a plan. Under his guidance, I officially withdrew from Atlanta Community College. I closed my old bank account. I got a new phone number. He helped me legally activate the trust and establish my new identity. I wasn't Michaela Franklin anymore. I was Michaela Isaiah, taking my grandfather's name as my own. My last act as Michaela Franklin was to go to the bank. I withdrew $40 in cash from my new trust fund. I placed the 4 $10 bills into a plain white envelope. Inside, I wrote a simple 7-word note. Here is your $40 back, tip included. I mailed it to the Buckhead mansion. 2 days later, I was on a one-way flight to Austin, Texas. Dr. Vance had connections everywhere. He said Austin was the new hub for fintech, the perfect place to build Beacon. I left everything behind. My old life, my old school, my old name, and my family. I cut off all contact. Back in Atlanta, the $40 arrived. I later learned from Dr. Vance that the reaction was exactly what I expected. My family had returned from the gala, drunk on champagne and self-importance, probably wondering if I had cleaned up the pizza boxes. When they found the envelope, Simone was furious. She called my phone repeatedly, leaving a string of vicious, screaming voicemails that I never heard. "How dare you! You ungrateful little brat! You are finished! Do you hear me?" When her calls went unanswered, when she realized my number was disconnected, the anger turned to smug satisfaction. "She's actually gone," she announced to my parents over brunch. "She's probably living in some shelter." My father, Marcus, shook his head. "She's an ungrateful child. She's impulsive and emotional. She'll fail within 6 months. Mark my words, she'll come crawling back, begging us to take her in." They laughed. They felt secure, believing they had won. They had finally gotten rid of the inconvenient daughter. They went back to their parties and their business, content in the knowledge that I was out in the world, alone and failing. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that their dropout daughter hadn't just disappeared. She was being funded. She was being mentored. and she was already building the empire that would one day return to settle the score. 2 years passed. 2 years of silence. 2 years of relentless, focused work. The Michaela Franklin who had fled Atlanta in a 20-year-old pair of jeans was gone. In her place was Isaiah, the 22-year-old CEO of Beacon FinTech. Here in Austin, I didn't wear stained hoodies. I wore custom-tailored blazers. I didn't beg for $40 for pizza. I commanded boardrooms. Dr. Vance, true to his word, had stepped in not as a savior, but as a mentor. He was my chairman, guiding me through the ruthless world of venture capital and corporate strategy. Beacon FinTech was more than a success. It was a revolution. Our software, the very idea that Chad had laughed at, was now the gold standard for community banks across the country. We were the ones giving local institutions the power to fight back against the predatory giants. We weren't just selling software anymore, we were starting to buy the banks themselves. Our strategy was simple and aggressive. Find a small, struggling community bank, acquire it, integrate our Beacon technology, and turn it profitable within 6 months. It was working. In 24 months, my net worth on paper had grown to an estimated $50 million. But no one knew it was me. The tech world knew of the mysterious Isaiah, the quiet, brilliant founder of Beacon. But I never did interviews. I never allowed photos. My identity was the most closely guarded secret in my company. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that my family's greed was matched only by their arrogance. If they ever found out about my success, they wouldn't be proud. They would be predatory. They would come for it. So I stayed in the shadows, building my empire, one acquisition at a time. I was no longer a dropout. I was a shark, silently circling in the deep water, and I knew, eventually, the blood in the water would lead me back home. Back in Atlanta, my family remained blissfully unaware. Life in the Buckhead mansion continued its glittering, hollow rhythm. I learned later, through the financial auditing reports, just how blissfully unaware they were. Simone and Chad were spending money faster than ever. Chad had leased a new white Maserati. Simone had taken a 2-week girls' trip to Dubai, posting endless photos of herself draped in designer clothes, a champagne glass permanently attached to her hand. They were the perfect image of Atlanta high society. And what of Michaela? I had ceased to exist. Or rather, I existed only as a cautionary tale, a punchline to be used at their elegant dinner parties. Dr. Vance, who still had some distant, quiet connections to the Atlanta business community, told me I was now referred to, if I was referred to at all, as the dropout. Simone apparently loved to tell the story of that final Christmas night. You should have seen her face, she'd tell her laughing friends over brunch. Sprinting out into the cold, no coat, over a community college class. So dramatic. My father, Marcus, would just shake his head. She was always too emotional. She never had a head for business. No resilience. They didn't just forget me. They actively rewrote the narrative to justify their own actions. They assumed, with the smug certainty of the privileged, that I was struggling. They pictured me waiting tables at a diner or working as a cashier, barely making rent. In their minds, this was the only logical outcome for someone who had defied them. My failure was necessary for their story to make sense. The climax of their delusion happened one Sunday night. The family was gathered for dinner. My mother, Denise, was stressed about an upcoming charity ball. The guest list is a nightmare, she sighed, sipping her Chardonnay. Chad laughed. Well, at least you don't have to worry about Michaela showing up and embarrassing us. Simone chimed in. God, can you imagine? If she showed up in one of those ratty old hoodies, I'd die. My mother looked genuinely alarmed by the thought. She put her glass down, her face tight with anxiety. Marcus, that's not funny. I actually have nightmares that she's going to call here, begging for money. Can you imagine the embarrassment? What would we even tell people? The embarrassment. That was her only concern. As my mother fretted in Atlanta about me asking for money, I was in my penthouse office in Austin, finishing a very different call. Ms. Isaiah, the editor from Forbes said through the speakerphone, a cover story. It would be huge. The woman remaking American banking. We're ready to print. I looked out at the Austin skyline. I appreciate the offer, Michael, I said, but I'm not interested in the publicity. My work speaks for itself. Beacon is not about me, it's about the mission. Please take my name off the list. I hung up the phone. I didn't need a magazine cover. I was busy building my weapon. The reckoning I had predicted didn't just knock, it kicked the door in. Back in Atlanta, 2 years after I had walked out, Marcus Bank was dying. The collapse started just as I knew it would. Their technology was a joke, a relic from a different era. All their younger customers, the sons and daughters of my father's old money clients, had fled years ago. They moved their money to banking apps that actually worked, apps that looked a lot like Beacon. But now, the trickle had become a flood. The older, loyal customers were finally panicking. Rumors of insolvency were spreading through Buckhead. My father, Marcus, called an emergency family meeting at the mansion. The panic in the air was so thick you could taste it. Marcus paced the Persian rug in his study, his face a sickly gray. He wasn't the powerful patriarch anymore. He was a cornered man. My mother, Denise, was twisting her pearls, a nervous tic I recognized from my childhood. "Marcus, what are we going to do?" she whispered. "We need $5 million, he announced, his voice cracking. An immediate cash injection. If we don't find it, the FDIC is seizing the bank." He looked wildly at the calendar, as if it were the enemy. "We have 30 days. 30 days until the Franklin name is dragged through the mud. Everything my father, Isaiah, built, ruined." Simone looked pale, her expensive manicure tapping nervously on her phone. Chad, her husband, was sweating visibly through his silk shirt. My father stared at them, a desperate, greedy light entering his eyes. He saw one last lifeline. "The education fund," he said, his voice low and urgent. He zeroed in on Simone. "The money Granddad Isaiah left for the kids. How much is in it? We need to drain it. We need it now." The room went deathly still. Deathly. My father's desperate question about the education fund hung in the air, unanswered. Simone, for the first time in her life, looked cornered. She didn't look at our father. She looked at her husband, Chad. Chad, who had been so smug and dismissive just 2 years ago, was now pale, his upper lip beaded with sweat. He tugged at the collar of his expensive shirt, his eyes darting between Marcus and Simone. "Chad?" my father pressed, his voice sharp with dawning dread. "How much is in the account?" "Well, you see, Marcus," Chad began, his voice slick with a salesman's false confidence. I was trying to help." Simone visibly flinched. She knew what was coming. "The bank needed a miracle," Chad continued, standing up and trying to pace, as if he could explain away the impending disaster. I have friends in the crypto space. High yield, fast turnaround. I saw an opportunity to get ahead of this problem. A quick flip, double our money, save the bank." "What? What did you do, Chad?" my mother, Denise, whispered, her hand going to her throat. "I just borrowed it," Chad said, the word sounding obscene. "I took the funds from the education account. It was just sitting there, not even earning real interest. I was going to put it all back before anyone even noticed." "How much?" Marcus demanded. Chad swallowed hard. "The market. It turned. It was unpredictable." "How much, Chad?" my father roared, slamming his fist on his desk. Chad cringed, his facade shattering completely. "All of it," he whispered. "I lost all of it." My mother let out a small, strangled cry. "All of it?" $1.2 million, Chad admitted, his voice barely audible. "It's all gone." The sound of my mother collapsing was the only thing that broke the silence. She didn't faint. She simply crumpled into a chair, her hand covering her mouth as a sob tore through her. "Oh, God," she wailed, looking at my father with terrified eyes. "Marcus, that was Michaela's money. That was her inheritance." The admission hung in the air. They knew. They knew it was hers, and they had let Simone and Chad control it. Simone, however, just rolled her eyes, disgusted not by the crime, but by the weakness. "Oh, get up, mother," she snapped, stepping over her. "It was family money, and it's gone. Crying won't fix it." She turned to my father, her mind already on the next move. "And $1 million wouldn't have been enough anyway. It's gone. Forget it. We need a real investor." My father, Marcus, spent the next week in a desperate flurry of activity. He called every contact he had. He begged old golf buddies, cashed in favors, and humbled himself in ways I never thought possible. But the answer was always the same: no. The banking world knew Marcus Bank was toxic. No one in Atlanta would touch it. The Franklin name, once a symbol of stability, was now poison. Simone, meanwhile, was doing the only thing she knew how, scrolling frantically through her phone, not looking for solutions, but for a miracle. And in her mind, she found one. She burst into my father's study, where he was staring blankly at a stack of foreclosure notices. "Dad, look," she said, shoving her phone in his face. "Beacon FinTech. It's a company in Austin. Look at their press releases. Beacon acquires Midwest Community Bank, projects full profitability in 6 months. Beacon Tech revitalizes struggling Texas credit union." She was practically vibrating with excitement. "This is what they do," she said. "They specialize in saving failing community banks. They're our only hope." My father squinted at the screen, reading the articles. A flicker of something, maybe hope, crossed his tired face. "Beacon FinTech," he murmured. "Who runs it?" "The CEO is famously private," Simone said, scrolling. No photos. The name is just listed as M. Isaiah. My father let out a dry, bitter laugh. M. Isaiah. The same initials as my father, Isaiah Franklin. He shook his head at the cruel irony. "As if his ghost has come back to watch this place burn." "Who cares what the name is?" Simone snapped, already dialing. "They're our last chance." They started immediately. They sent emails to the generic info address on the Beacon website. They left voicemails on the main corporate line. "To the CEO of Beacon FinTech," my father dictated, his voice regaining a fraction of its old authority. "This is Marcus Franklin of Marcus Bank in Atlanta. We have a unique partnership opportunity we would like to discuss. A merger of legacy and innovation. Please contact us at your earliest convenience." They sent that message, and others like it, over and over, into a digital void, completely unaware that every single desperate plea was landing directly on the laptop of the dropout daughter they thought was waiting tables. It was a Tuesday morning in Austin, and I was standing in my corner office overlooking the skyline. My assistant, Ryan, buzzed in on the intercom. "Ms. Isaiah," his voice was crisp. "Marcus Bank is on line 1 again. That's the 5th time this week. It's that woman, Simone. She sounds insistent." I looked at the phone, at the blinking red light. Marcus Bank. For a second, I wasn't in my CEO office. I was back in that cold, drafty bus, my face wet with tears, the sound of Simone's voice screaming dropout echoing in my ears. I remembered the humiliation, the fear, the cold finality of that door slamming shut. "Ms. Isaiah?" Ryan asked, pulling me back to the present. I turned away from the window, my voice steady and cold. "Let them wait, Ryan. Let it go to voicemail. Again." "Yes, ma'am." I knew exactly what that silence was doing. Back in Atlanta, it wasn't just panic, it was a full-blown meltdown. Every day that Beacon FinTech ignored them, another nail was hammered into the coffin of the Franklin legacy. I knew my father. His pride was everything. This silence, this powerlessness, would be eating him alive. Dr. Vance had confirmed it. His contacts in Atlanta reported that Marcus was in a spiral. He'd stopped going to the bank. He was spending his days in his study, drinking. The foreclosure auction date had been set, and the reality was sinking in. Simone wasn't just insistent. She was terrified. Her entire identity, her lavish lifestyle, her social standing, it was all tied to the bank. Without it, she was just a 32-year-old woman with no real job, a mountain of debt, and a husband who had just lost $1.2 million. The silence wasn't just a negotiating tactic. It was the first part of their punishment. It was the sound of their perfect, curated world beginning to crack. After a week of deafening silence from Austin, the panic in the Buckhead mansion had become a thick, choking fog. The FDIC's 30-day deadline was now just 2 weeks away. "They're not responding!" Simone shrieked, throwing her phone onto the sofa. "Not one email, not one returned call. Don't they know who we are?" Marcus was pacing, his face haggard. "They know exactly who we are, Simone. We're a failing bank. We're desperate. They're just waiting for us to bleed out so they can buy us for pennies." Denise was weeping quietly in the corner. "Everything," she whispered. "We're going to lose everything." "Stop it, both of you!" Marcus snapped, his mind racing. He was trying to think, to find another angle. There had to be someone else. He thought back, digging through decades of contacts, back to his father's time. Suddenly he froze. "Elias," he whispered. Simone looked up, annoyed. "What?" "Elias Vance," Marcus said, his eyes lighting up with a sudden manic hope. "Your grandfather's old friend. The one who moved to Texas. He's a venture capitalist. A huge one. If anyone in Austin knows this beacon company, it's him." Simone's demeanor changed instantly. The panic vanished, replaced by the calculating charm she always used to get her way. She grabbed her phone, her fingers flying as she tracked down a number. "Dr. Vance's private office," she said, practicing her tone. "Give me the phone, Dad. You sound too desperate. I'll handle this." She made the call. Meanwhile, in Austin, I was in my office with Dr. Vance, reviewing the final legal documents for the Marcus Bank debt acquisition. My phone buzzed. It was his assistant. "Dr. Vance," I said, sliding the phone to him. "It's your office. A call from a Simone Franklin." A slow, wolfish smile spread across Elias's face. He looked at me, his eyes twinkling. "Well, well, well," he said. He tapped the phone, putting the call on speaker for me to hear. "Dr. Vance." Simone's voice, dripping with false sweetness and manufactured panic, filled the room. "Elias, this is Simone Franklin, Marcus Franklin's daughter. I don't know if you remember me." "Simone, of course," Elias said, his voice a perfect blend of warmth and surprise. "How are you? How are Marcus and Denise?" "Oh, we're in a bit of trouble, Dr. Vance," Simone said, her voice catching with a perfectly rehearsed sob. "Our family bank. We're being targeted by these big corporations. We just need a little help. We're trying to contact a new company called Beacon FinTech, but we can't get through. I know you're the most connected man in Texas. I was just praying you might know them, that you could help us get a meeting." I watched Elias, who was leaning back in his chair, tapping his fingers together, enjoying every second. He winked at me. "Beacon FinTech," he said, as if pondering. "Why, yes. As a matter of fact, I know the CEO very well. Brilliant mind. We're very close." I heard Simone let out a gasp of pure relief on the other end. "You do? Oh, thank God, Elias. Could you please just get us in the room with them? We need to talk about a partnership." "Of course, Simone," Elias said smoothly, his eyes locked on mine. "Anything for Isaiah's family. Tell you what, can you and your father fly to Austin next week? I'll set up the meeting personally." The flight to Austin was a fresh layer of humiliation. My family, the Franklins of Buckhead, were crammed into economy class. Middle seats, no legroom. My father, Marcus, stared blankly at the seat back in front of him, his face a mask of barely suppressed rage. My mother, Denise, kept reapplying hand sanitizer, as if trying to wipe away the scent of the common folk around them. Simone, naturally, was the most vocal. She yanked the thin blanket provided by the airline, her lip curled in disgust. "This is unbelievable," she hissed, her voice low enough for only the family to hear. "I can feel the germs on this seat. I just hope this Beacon FinTech person is worth it. I hope they know who we are." "We're the ones coming to them begging, Simone," my father muttered, not looking at her. "Right now, who we are is irrelevant." "That's where you're wrong, Daddy," Simone shot back. "Reputation is everything. They'll be lucky to have the Franklin name associated with their little tech company." Beside her, Chad, my brother-in-law, was visibly sweating. He kept loosening his tie, his knee bouncing frantically. "Simone," he whispered, leaning in close. "Are you sure this is a good idea? Me coming? What if... what if they ask about the bank's finances? What about you know, the trust fund?" Simone let out an exasperated sigh, loud enough for the passenger in front of them to turn around. She gave the woman a withering look until she turned back. "Would you relax?" she snapped at Chad. "No one knows about that. It's a family matter, a simple internal transfer." She waved her hand dismissively, as if swatting away his $1.2 million crime. "As long as that ungrateful little dropout Michaela stays wherever she's flipping burgers, we are perfectly safe. No one knows. No one ever will." She put on her noise-canceling headphones, a clear sign that the conversation was over. Chad was left to stare at his reflection in the dark window, while I, hundreds of miles away, was reviewing the final line items of their bank's debt. They were flying directly into the storm, and they didn't even see the clouds. The Uber pulled up to the curb, and the Franklin family stood for a full minute, staring up in stunned silence. The Beacon FinTech headquarters was not a building, it was a monument. It was a soaring tower of glass and brushed steel that seemed to pierce the Austin sky. It didn't smell like old money, dusty carpets, and mahogany, like their bank. It smelled new, sharp, and intimidatingly expensive. My father, Marcus, visibly straightened his tie, looking small and rumpled against the towering glass entrance. My mother, Denise, clutched her outdated designer bag, her eyes wide with an intimidation she couldn't hide. Even Simone, my sister, seemed momentarily silenced by the sheer scale of the place. They were greeted in the lobby, not by a simple receptionist, but by an executive assistant. He was young, impossibly sharp, in a slim-fit suit, and held a tablet. "Mr. Franklin? Ms. Franklin? Mr. O'Ryan?" He didn't smile. "Right this way." He led them through a massive, open-concept lobby where a 3-story living wall of green plants cascaded down one side. Employees, young, diverse, buzzing with energy, collaborated on massive touchscreen monitors. It was everything their bank was not. It was alive, it was modern, and it was clearly worth a fortune. The assistant guided them into the main boardroom on the top floor. It was vast and minimalist. One entire wall was a single pane of glass overlooking the entire city of Austin. A long, black marble table sat in the center, empty except for 4 glasses of water. "Please have a seat," the assistant said, his voice echoing slightly in the large space. "Dr. Vance and the CEO will see you shortly." He closed the door, leaving them alone in the sterile, opulent silence. My family sat down, looking completely out of place. Marcus began muttering, rehearsing his lines. "Elias, we're in a tough spot. The market turned..." Simone cut him off, her voice a harsh whisper. "Stop it, Daddy. You sound weak. You sound like a beggar." She leaned forward, trying to regain her usual command. "We are the Franklins. They aren't doing us a favor. We are offering them the Atlanta market. They should be honored to have the Franklin name attached to their little app." Chad, her husband, nodded vigorously, though he was still sweating. "She's right, Marcus. We play this strong. We're offering them a legacy." My father just looked down at his hands, defeated. He knew the truth. They weren't partners. They were the disease, begging for a cure. The silence in the room stretched out, broken only by the sound of Simone impatiently tapping her acrylic nail on the cold marble. They were waiting for a savior, expecting some Silicon Valley tech billionaire to walk in. They rehearsed their lies. They prepared their excuses. They had no idea they were waiting for the daughter they had disowned. The heavy glass door at the end of the boardroom finally clicked open. Dr. Vance walked in, not alone. He was flanked by two men, both white, both in suits so expensive they seemed to whisper old-world law firm. They carried identical leather briefcases. They looked like the kind of lawyers who billed by the minute and never lost. "Hello, Marcus." "Simone," Dr. Vance said, his voice pleasant. He gestured for the lawyers to sit. My father, Marcus, stood up, fumbling with his tie. He was trying to look like an equal, but he just looked like a man in a rumpled suit. "Elias, thank you for arranging this. This is quite the operation you have here. Shall we wait for the CEO?" Simone was already visibly annoyed. "Yes, can we get on with this? We have a flight to catch tonight." Dr. Vance smiled, a slow, patient smile. "The CEO is on her way now." As if on cue, the heavy glass door at the end of the room clicked open again. This time, it was not a man. It was me. I was no longer the 20-year-old girl in the stained hoodie. I was 22. My hair was cut in a sharp, angled bob that framed my face. I wore a black Tom Ford pantsuit, custom-tailored, with sharp shoulders. My heels clicked with a precise cold sound on the marble floor. I did not look at them, not yet. I walked to the head of the long table, placing my own leather portfolio down. I heard a small sound, a sharp gasp, followed by the clatter of a designer bag hitting the floor. I turned. My mother's hand was at her chest. My father's mouth was open, his face a picture of pure, unfiltered disbelief. And Simone. Her face was a mask of horror. "Michaela?" she breathed, her voice a reedy whisper. Then, her arrogance kicked back in, a desperate, reflexive sneer. What are you doing here? Are you getting the coffee?" I looked at her. I let the silence stretch out, letting her insult hang in the air of the $10 million room. I sat down in the large black leather chair at the head of the table. I folded my hands. "No, Simone," I said, my voice clear and cold, echoing slightly. "I am not getting the coffee." I looked at each of them, one by one. "I am Isaiah Franklin, CEO and chairwoman of the board of Beacon FinTech. I am the one you are here to beg for help from." I leaned forward slightly. "Hello, Dad. Hello, Mom. Hello, Simone." My father's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. My mother, Denise, just stared, her hands frozen in her lap. Chad looked like he had seen a ghost. Simone was the first to find her voice, her shock turning instantly to rage. "A joke," she spat. "This is some kind of sick, twisted joke. Daddy, she's playing a game. You hired her, Elias? You hired her to embarrass us?" Dr. Vance simply looked at me. He and the two lawyers remained silent. I ignored her. I ignored all of them. I turned my back to them and faced the massive presentation screen that filled the far wall. I pressed the first button on the remote in my hand. The screen lit up with a blinding white light, which then resolved into a single, brutal title slide. Analysis: The Collapse of Marcus Bank. I turned back to the table, my expression neutral. "Good morning," I said, my voice crisp and clear in the silent room. "Thank you for coming. Please sit down, Father. We have a lot to get through." My father, as if by remote control, slowly sank back into his chair. "This presentation," I began, clicking to the next slide, "will outline the catastrophic failures of Marcus Bank over the last 36 months. As you can see from this first chart, your customer base under the age of 40 has declined by 62%. Your acquisition cost for new customers is 400% higher than the industry average. Why?" I didn't wait for an answer. I clicked again. A screenshot of their mobile app appeared. It looked like something I had designed in high school. "Because this is your technology. It's obsolete, it's insecure, and it offers zero of the features that modern customers demand." My company, Beacon, controls 70% of the fintech market for community banks in the Southeast. You control zero. You, you, Marcus stammered. I continued, my voice cold and precise, steamrolling his attempt to speak. Let's move on to your loan portfolio. Another slide appeared, this one a terrifying spiderweb of red lines. Your portfolio of non-performing unsecured debt is, to be blunt, negligent. You've extended lines of credit to failing businesses, including several linked directly to your own board members. I looked right at Chad. He turned a shade of pale green. But the core issue, I said, clicking to my final slide, is a complete failure of leadership, a refusal to adapt, a reliance on reputation over performance, and a critical lack of internal controls. I let that slide hang in the air for a moment. I looked at the four of them. They were no longer the powerful Franklin family. They were just four frightened people, completely out of their depth. I turned off the monitor. In conclusion, I said, walking slowly back to the head of the table, you haven't come here to discuss a partnership. Beacon does not partner with insolvent institutions. You are here because this is not a bank in trouble. This is a relic, a dead institution that just hasn't been buried yet. I let the silence in the room stretch, letting the word relic hang in the air. My father looked crushed. My mother, Denise, was pale. Then I pressed the remote again. A new slide appeared. The title was simple, written in bold red letters: Internal Financial Malfeasance. I turned my chair slightly to look directly at my brother-in-law, Chad. He was the only one who had remained silent, his eyes fixed on the marble table. This next section, Chad, I said, my voice dropping, is just for you. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. I clicked. The screen was filled with bank statements, wire transfers, dates, amounts. I had highlighted two key items. The first was a series of withdrawals from the Franklin Family Education Fund, the very fund Simone had lorded over me. The withdrawals were disguised as tuition payments and educational expenses. The second item was a corresponding set of deposits into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, an account under the name C. O'Ryan Enterprises. Chad's full name was Chad O'Ryan. As you can see, I narrated, my voice echoing in the dead silent room, $1.2 million was systematically drained from my grandfather's education fund over the last 18 months. From this Cayman account, it was then moved into a series of high-risk crypto wallets. I clicked again. A chart showed the crypto wallet's value. It was now worth less than $5,000. Chad shot to his feet, knocking his chair over. I don't, that's not, it was a loan. I was going to pay it back. Simone, seeing her husband fall apart, went on the attack. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at me. You did this! You hacked us! You have no proof! This is illegal! We'll sue you! I looked at her, my expression unchanged. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to hack you, Simone, I said. I'm the sole beneficiary of that trust fund. You were just the administrator. Dr. Vance spoke up for the first time, his voice like rolling thunder. When Ms. Isaiah activated her private trust 2 years ago, she and I, as executors of her grandfather's estate, ordered a full forensic audit of all of Isaiah Franklin's assets. That included the fund you were managing. I leaned forward. You didn't just lose family money, Chad. You stole my money. And seeing as the transfers crossed state lines and involved offshore accounts, that isn't just a family matter. That is federal wire fraud. The word fraud finally broke them. My mother, Denise, made a sound, a high-pitched, terrible wail that was half sob, half scream. The mask of the elegant buckhead wife melted away, revealing the terrified woman underneath. Michaela, she cried, her voice cracking. Michaela, please, you can't. We're your family. You can't do this to Simone. You can't do this to your father. This would destroy us. I watched her, my face impassive. Family? I repeated. Is that what we are? Family doesn't force their daughter to babysit so they can go to a party. Family doesn't threaten to take away their daughter's education. And family certainly doesn't steal her inheritance. It was a mistake, she pleaded, tears now streaming down her face. Chad made a mistake. No, I said. A mistake is spilling coffee. Stealing $1.2 million is a federal crime. My father, Marcus, had been sitting in stunned silence. He looked like he had aged 20 years in 20 minutes. He finally raised his head. His eyes, once so arrogant, now looked defeated. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in my life. You're right, Michaela, he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. The rest of the table looked at him in shock. You were right all along, about the bank, about the technology. I underestimated you. I was a fool. He put his head in his hands. Please, Michaela. I'm begging you. Don't let the bank fail. Don't destroy your grandfather's legacy. It was everything he built. His plea hung in the air. The legacy, the name, the one thing he had left to bargain with. I almost laughed. It was so perfectly, predictably, him. My grandfather's legacy? I asked, my voice soft. You want to talk about Isaiah's legacy? I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city. My grandfather's legacy was innovation. It was integrity. It was believing in the future, a future I showed you 2 years ago, which you dismissed. I turned back to them, my voice turning to ice. My grandfather's legacy is me. He believed in me. And what did you do with his legacy? You treated me like a free babysitter. You called me a dropout. You let my brother-in-law, this thief, use the family bank as his personal ATM to gamble on cryptocurrency. I looked at my father. You don't get to talk to me about his legacy. You aren't worthy of his legacy. My words hung in the air, thick and heavy. My mother, Denise, was still sobbing, and my father looked like a broken man. He had just begged me to save his legacy. I let him wait in that desperate silence for a long, painful moment. All right, I said finally, my voice cutting through the quiet. Since we're family, I put the word in air quotes, I will give you one choice, one option, one way out. My father looked up, a desperate, pathetic flicker of hope in his eyes. Anything, Michaela. Anything. I looked at my lawyers, who nodded. I turned back to my family. Here's the offer. Beacon FinTech will acquire Marcus Bank for the price of $1. Chad and Simone gasped. $1? For $1, I repeated. I will personally absorb all of the bank's toxic debt. I will stop the FDIC seizure. I will restructure the company. I will save it. My mother started to cry with relief. Oh, Michaela, thank you, I am not finished, I said, silencing her. There are conditions, non-negotiable. I looked at my father, my mother, and my sister. Condition 1. Marcus, Denise, and Simone will sign over their entire full and complete share of the company. You will walk away with nothing. No severance, no stock options, no title. Condition 2, I said, turning my full attention to my brother-in-law, who was trying to blend into the wall. Chad, he flinched. You will sign a full legal confession, drafted by my attorneys right here, admitting to the $1.2 million embezzlement of my trust fund. In return, as a show of family loyalty, I will not pursue federal charges for the separate embezzlement I found inside the bank's loan portfolio. That will, as you say, help the family save face. I let the terms sink in. I was offering them a choice between total humiliation and mere financial ruin. My father looked like he was going to be sick, but it was Simone who recovered first. Her shock melted away, replaced by the familiar, arrogant sneer I had known my whole life. She let out a short, sharp laugh. $1? She shrieked, her voice high and incredulous. $1? After everything our family built? You are insulting us. You are trying to humiliate us. We would rather file for bankruptcy. We would rather lose everything than hand over our legacy to you." Simone's defiant laugh echoed in the sterile boardroom. "We would rather lose everything," she had said. I looked at her, my expression unreadable. "Bankruptcy?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "You really think you still have a choice in the matter?" Simone stared at me, her arrogant smile foul-tearing. "Of course we have a choice. It's our bank." I didn't answer her. Instead, I just nodded slowly at Dr. Vance. He looked at my father, Marcus, with an expression of profound disappointment. "Marcus," he said, "I was hoping it wouldn't come to this. For your father's sake." He signaled to one of the lawyers, who opened his briefcase and produced a thick, heavily bound document. The lawyer slid it across the marble table. It stopped directly in front of my father. "What? What is this?" Marcus stammered, his hands trembling as he reached for it. "That," Dr. Vance said, "is a copy of the original promissory note for the $20 million loan your father, Isaiah, personally guaranteed for Marcus Bank 20 years ago. The loan you took out to fund your reckless expansion. The loan you nearly defaulted on." "I paid that back," Marcus said, his voice rising in panic. "No, Marcus, you didn't," Dr. Vance corrected him. "You missed 3 payments. Your creditors were preparing to seize the bank, so Isaiah, in secret, bought the debt. He paid it in full to save you from ruin, and he became your sole creditor." "And that loan," I said, finally speaking, "was secured against the one thing he knew you'd never sell. The collateral on that loan, Dad, is your 51% controlling stake in Marcus Bank." My father's face went from pale to a sickly ashen gray. Dr. Vance delivered the final blow. "As executor of Isaiah's estate, that loan, and its collateral, was legally transferred to the Isaiah Franklin Private Trust, Michaela's trust." I stood up slowly, looking down at the family that had discarded me. "And you defaulted on your first payment to me 3 months ago." The default. 3 months ago. The words hung in the room, sucking all the air out. Simone's face, which had been twisted in a mask of arrogant rage, collapsed. She stumbled back, her hand fumbling for a chair that wasn't there. "No," she whispered. "No, that's not possible." "Oh, it's very possible," I said, my voice calm. "I don't need to buy your bank, Father. I'm not here to negotiate." I walked slowly from the window back to the head of the table. "I'm here to collect it." I looked at all of them. My mother, my father, my sister, my brother-in-law, the 4 people who had discarded me. "The $1 offer," I said, "was a courtesy. It was a chance for you to walk away with a single shred of dignity instead of being thrown out of your own bank like the failures you are." Complete, utter silence. My father's face was ashen. My mother was openly weeping, her hands covering her face. And then, the first domino fell. Chad, my brother-in-law, the man who had laughed at my dreams. He lunged forward, his eyes wild with terror. He wasn't thinking about the bank, or the family, or Simone. He was thinking about the federal fraud charges. "I'll sign!" he shrieked, grabbing a pen from the center of the table. "I'll sign the confession! Just don't charge me! Please!" My father, Marcus, just stared at me. He was trembling, his gaze unfocused. He saw me, but he was seeing the 20-year-old in the stained hoodie, the 16-year-old he forced to miss her prom. He whispered so low I could barely hear it. "The babysitter. Our little babysitter." Dr. Vance, who had been silent, stepped forward. His voice was cold as steel. "The babysitter," he said, "is now your creditor, and as her advisor, I strongly recommend you sign the acquisition agreement, because if you don't, she will not just take the bank. She will take everything, the house, the cars, and she will press federal charges against your son-in-law." That was it, the final push. My father's shoulders slumped, the last bit of his lifelong arrogance deflating like a popped balloon. He picked up the pen with a shaking hand and signed his name, giving away his father's legacy. Then he pushed the paper to Simone. She stared at it, her tears dripping onto the document. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. With a choked sob, she scribbled her signature. I collected the papers. I tapped them neatly on the marble table. The deal was done. "Thank you," I said, my voice empty of all emotion. I stood up and looked at my family. "Now please get out of my boardroom." My lawyers gathered the signed confessions and the acquisition papers. They slid them neatly into their briefcases, their faces impassive. My family was still frozen, as if they couldn't process what had just happened. My mother, Denise, was weeping silently into a silk handkerchief. My father, Marcus, was staring at the marble table, his face slack and gray. Simone was the only one still fighting, her eyes fixed on me, radiating a pure, undiluted hatred. "I believe we're finished here," I said. I looked past them and nodded to the door. Two large security guards who had been waiting discreetly in the hallway entered the boardroom. They weren't aggressive, but their presence was absolute. They were both tall, built like linebackers, and did not look impressed by my family's expensive, rumpled clothing. "Sirs, ma'am," the first guard said, his voice polite but firm. "This way, please." My father stood up, but his legs seemed to shake. He looked for the first time like an old man. My mother had to be helped from her chair by the second guard. Simone stood, snatching her purse from the floor, but the fight was gone. Her arrogance had evaporated, leaving only a sour, childish petulance. Chad just shambled behind them, his gaze fixed on the floor, a man already in a prison of his own making. The walk from that top-floor boardroom to the main entrance was the longest walk of their lives. They had to cross the massive, open-concept lobby, the same lobby they had marched through just an hour earlier, filled with arrogance, pitying the little tech company they were about to negotiate with. Now all those young, energetic employees paused their work. They stopped typing. They looked up from their meetings, they watched. They saw the Franklins of Atlanta, the supposed pillars of the community, being escorted out by building security. My father couldn't meet anyone's gaze. Simone tried to hold her head high, but her face was blotchy and red from her tears of rage. One of my young marketing associates, the one I'd just hired, was holding his phone up, clearly recording the entire procession. He was capturing the perfect contrast, the arrogant entrance, the humiliated exit. That footage, I knew, would be circulating internally within 10 minutes. The Franklin myth, the one built on lies and propped up by my grandfather's money, was dead. I didn't watch them cross the lobby. I had already turned away. I walked back into my private office, the one adjacent to the boardroom. Dr. Vance followed me, closing the heavy glass door softly behind us. My office was all glass, overlooking the front plaza of the building. We didn't need to be in the lobby to see the final act. We stood side by side, 50 floors up, looking down. We watched the four of them spill out of the revolving glass doors. They looked confused, blinded by the bright Texas sun. They huddled on the sidewalk, a pathetic, rumpled group, arguing about which rideshare app to use. The black Bentley that had dropped them off was nowhere in sight. Simone shoved Chad. He stumbled, almost falling into a planter. My father walked a few paces away, his back to all of them, a man utterly alone. My mother just stood by the curb, holding her expensive, useless handbag, looking completely lost. They looked small. They looked weak. Dr. Vance was quiet for a long time. I could hear the faint sound of the city traffic below. "Your grandfather," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Isaiah. He would be so, so proud of you, Michaela. He always knew you had the steel. He just prayed you'd get the chance to show it." I watched as a standard, dusty Toyota Camry pulled up to the curb. I watched my family, the great, proud Franklins, cram themselves into the back seat, Simone and my mother fighting over the luggage in the trunk. The car pulled away, disappearing into the midday traffic. I took a deep breath. The knot of tension I had carried in my chest for 2 years, maybe even my whole life, finally dissolved. It was over. He would be proud, I agreed. I turned away from the window, my mind already shifting, calculating, moving to the next task. The real work was about to begin. But we're just getting started. 3 months later, I was back in Atlanta. I stood in the lobby of what was once Marcus Bank. The heavy mahogany desks, the dusty velvet ropes, the dim, yellow lighting. It was all gone. In its place was the new flagship branch of Beacon Community Bank. The lobby was open, bright, and buzzing with energy. Sunlight streamed through new skylights onto polished concrete floors. Instead of teller windows, there were open, welcoming pods where financial advisors sat side by side with customers, using Beacon's sleek tablet interfaces. The air smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. I was addressing the entire staff, many of whom had worked under my father for decades. They were gathered in the new atrium, their faces a mixture of anxiety and curiosity. They expected a bloodbath. They expected the new young CEO from Austin to clean house. I stepped up to the podium, looking out at them. "Good morning," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I know the last few months have been uncertain. You've heard rumors, you've seen the name on the building change, and you're probably wondering what your future is here." I saw an older teller, a woman named Mary who used to give me lollipops when I was a child, twisting her hands nervously. "So let me be perfectly clear," I said. "No one is being fired." A collective, audible sigh of relief went through the room. "But everyone," I continued, "is being retrained. The era of paper ledgers and outdated software is over. Starting today, every employee of this bank will begin a paid, comprehensive training program on the Beacon FinTech platform. We are not just giving this bank a new coat of paint, we are giving it a new engine." I looked around the room, making eye contact. This institution was founded by my grandfather, Isaiah Franklin. He founded it with a mission to serve this community, to provide fair loans, and to help families build wealth. Somewhere along the way, that mission was lost. It became about status, not service. I paused, letting the words sink in. We are bringing that original mission back, but we're going to do it with the technology of the 21st century. Welcome to Beacon Community Bank. As for the architects of my family's downfall, their new reality set in quickly. Chad, my brother-in-law, was the first to fall, just as he had been the first to sign the confession. He faced the court, not for the massive bank fraud which I could have pursued, but for the $1.2 million he stole from my trust fund. My lawyers advised me that we had enough to pursue federal charges that would have put him away for 10 years. But I declined. Prison felt too simple. I didn't want him just locked away. I wanted him stripped of the very power he had used to laugh at me. He pled guilty, of course. The evidence was absolute. The judge, seeing the clear confession, and perhaps influenced by my decision not to pursue the heavier charges, sentenced him to 5 years of probation and 2,000 hours of community service. He had to clean graffiti off highways, but that wasn't his real punishment. The SEC delivered the final fatal blow. Chad O'Ryan was permanently barred from the financial industry. He was forbidden, for life, from ever holding a position of financial trust, managing investments, or working in a bank. His entire identity, the slick finance guy who mocked my community college presentation, was erased. He was a professional ghost. And then there was Simone, my golden sister. Her divorce from Chad was finalized in less than 6 months. It turned out their marriage, like the bank, was built on a foundation of lies and projected wealth. Once the money was gone, once the social status had evaporated, there was nothing left to hold their toxic alliance together. She, who had never worked a real day in her life, was suddenly 32 years old, divorced and broke. The Buckhead mansion, the scene of my final humiliation, was seized and sold at auction to pay the bank's creditors. The Maseratis were repossessed. The designer clothes, I assume, were sold on consignment. I heard, through Dr. Vance, that she had moved into a small, one-bedroom apartment in East Atlanta, the side of town she used to make jokes about. But the real justice came 3 months after that. I was walking through Lenox Square, the high-end mall where Simone used to hold court, the place she and my mother spent their afternoons. I was meeting an architect to discuss the new bank lobby, and as I passed the main atrium, I saw her. She was working, standing behind the perfume counter at Neiman Marcus, wearing the store's standard black uniform. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her face was a mask of polite, forced enthusiasm. A wealthy, demanding woman, exactly the kind of person Simone used to be, was waving a scent strip in her face. "No, not that one," the woman snapped, her voice dripping with privilege. "I told you I wanted something with notes of jasmine, not gardenia. Are you even listening to me? This is the third time. Go get your manager." I watched as Simone, my proud, arrogant sister, who had threatened to ruin my life, just smiled that tight, empty customer service smile. "Yes, ma'am. Right away, ma'am," she said. She, who had never known a moment of humility, was now living a life defined by it. It was a far more fitting punishment than any I could have designed. My parents, Marcus and Denise, faced their own quiet ending. Their legacy was gone. The bank that bore our family name was now mine, and it bore my grandfather's name instead. The Buckhead Mansion, which was technically an asset of the bank's holding company, was seized and sold along with everything else. Their social standing in Atlanta evaporated overnight. They were no longer the powerful Franklins, hosts of the mayor's gala. They were the parents of a convicted embezzler and the failed managers of a historic bank. They now live in a small, rented condominium in a retirement community north of the city. Their arrogance, the armor they had worn for their entire lives, was gone. When I visited them last month, a visit I made on my own terms, my father didn't talk about business. He just asked me how my garden was doing. The great Marcus Franklin, who once laughed at my dreams, was finally, painfully, quiet. 6 months after the acquisition, I returned to Atlanta Community College. I didn't arrive by bus this time. I was driven. I walked through the same halls where I had once run, terrified of being late for my final. But I wasn't a student anymore. I was the guest of honor, the keynote speaker for the annual Future Founders Luncheon. Mrs. Gable, the professor who had looked at me with such disappointment when I'd burst in late 2 years ago, now greeted me at the door, her hands fluttering with nerves. "Ms. Isaiah, we are so honored to have you. Your story is, well, it's just incredible." I smiled at her, a real, warm smile. "Please, call me Michaela. And I'm the one who's honored to be back." I stood on the podium in the same small beige auditorium where I had given my final presentation. I looked out at the crowd of about 50 students, all of them bright, hungry, and full of ideas. I saw myself in their faces. I saw the same fear and the same desperate hope. I set my prepared speech aside. 2 years ago, I began, my voice clear and amplified by the microphone. I stood on this very stage as a student. I was terrified. I was late. I was wearing a stained hoodie, and I was, for all intents and purposes, homeless. The room went completely quiet. That night I gave a presentation for a project called Beacon, an idea I believed in. But I was running on fumes, and I was doing it in defiance of a family that told me I was a failure, a dropout who would be lucky to flip burgers. They told me that because I chose my education over babysitting, I was cut off. I paused, letting them take in the reality. I was cut off from a fund that I later learned was mine all along, but that's another story. What I'm here to talk about today is what happens next. What happens when you have an idea, but no one in your life believes in you? What happens when you don't have a family fund to fall back on? I signaled to Dr. Vance, who was sitting in the front row, beaming. He stood and joined me on stage, handing me an oversized presentation check. "Today," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "I am launching the Isaiah Franklin Innovation Fund, named for my grandfather, a man who believed in me when no one else did. This fund," I continued, "is endowed with $5 million." A collective gasp went through the room. "This money," I said, "is my original inheritance, the one my grandfather left for me. And now, I'm giving it away. It's not for me, it's for you." The Isaiah Franklin Fund is not a traditional scholarship, it is a seed fund. It will provide full tuition and housing for any student at this college who has a viable business plan. But more than that, it will provide startup capital. We are not just paying for your degree, we are investing in your company. And, I added, this fund is specifically earmarked for students who are first generation, who have been disowned, or who, for whatever reason, are building their dreams entirely on their own, with no family support. I then called a name. "Jasmine Rogers, would you please come up?" A young woman in the back row looked up, her face pale with shock. She looked just like I had 2 years ago, in a worn-out sweatshirt, her eyes bright but tired. She clutched a notebook to her chest. I had read her application personally, a brilliant idea for a logistics app, and a heartbreaking story of a family that had kicked her out for wanting to go to college. She walked to the stage as if in a dream. I turned to the crowd, holding the check so all could see. "Jasmine's family told her to be realistic," I said. "They told her to get a job at the local diner. Today, Beacon FinTech and the Isaiah Franklin Fund are being realistic. We are fully funding her tuition, and we are making the first investment in her company for $250,000. I handed her the check. She looked at it, then at me, and her knees buckled. Dr. Vance and I caught her, and as she cried, the entire room erupted in a standing ovation. This, I thought, looking at her, this is the real legacy. A year later. It was Christmas Eve again, but this was not my father's Christmas. This was mine. My penthouse in downtown Atlanta was full of light, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. The air wasn't tense with family obligations or the scent of my mother's expensive, overpowering perfume. It was warm, filled with genuine laughter, the sound of jazz playing softly, and the smell of spices from the caterer I'd hired. This was my party. Dr. Vance was standing by the modern, glass-enclosed fireplace, deep in a laughing conversation with my head of marketing. Across the room, Jasmine, the first recipient of the Isaiah Franklin Innovation Fund, was excitedly showing her app's beta version to a group of my developers. My real family was here, the colleagues who respected me, the friends who had stood by me when I had nothing, and the students I was now mentoring. I was handing out glasses of champagne, not being handed $40 for pizza. I was in the middle of a toast to my team when the building's intercom buzzed. I frowned. Everyone I had invited was already here. I walked over to the video panel by the elevator, champagne glass still in my hand, and I froze. The screen showed the lobby downstairs. Standing there, looking lost and small under the bright modern lights, were Marcus and Denise, my parents. My first instinct, a sharp, cold reflex, was to press the deny button, to just let them stand there. The memory of that last Christmas Eve, the humiliation, the cold bus ride, Simone's voice screaming, "Drop out." It all flared up, hot and sharp. What did they want? To criticize this party? To see what they could get? Dr. Vance, ever observant, noticed my expression and walked over quietly. "Who is it, Michaela?" I just pointed at the screen. He looked, and his expression hardened. "You don't have to see them," he said, his voice low. "I can call security and have them escorted out. You owe them nothing." I stared at their faces on the screen. They looked different. They weren't the powerful, imposing figures from my memory. They looked older, tired. My father's suit, the one he always wore, seemed a size too big for him now. My mother wasn't wearing her usual diamonds. No, I said, surprising myself. No, it's okay. Let them come up. I buzzed the lobby. Let them see. The ride up to the penthouse takes 60 seconds. I imagined what that minute must have felt like for them. The silent, high-speed elevator gliding past floors, taking them to a world they had actively tried to keep me from, a world they no longer controlled. The private elevator doors opened directly into my apartment's foyer. They stepped out and just stopped. They stared. They saw the double-height ceilings. They saw the modern art on the walls, real, investment-grade art that my grandfather would have loved. They saw the crowd of successful, happy, diverse people laughing and talking. This was a level of wealth, and more importantly, taste, that their gaudy Buckhead mansion had only ever pretended to have. They looked so out of place. My father, Marcus, was wearing an old sports coat. He was holding his hat in his hands, twisting the brim. My mother, Denise, wore a simple knit dress. No sequins, no jewels. And in her hands, she was clutching a blue plastic Tupperware container. It looked like homemade cookies. My mother, who had caterers for her breakfasts, was holding a container of homemade cookies. The music and laughter from the main room seemed to fade. The three of us just stood there in the foyer. "Michaela," my father started. His voice was rough. He cleared his throat and tried again. We know you're busy. We didn't mean to interrupt." My mother just stared at the floor, holding the container out slightly, as if it were a shield. "I baked these," she whispered. "They're oatmeal raisin. I remembered you used to like them." I looked at the cookies. I looked at these two strangers who shared my DNA. They weren't monsters anymore. They were just sad, defeated. They had lost their bank, their house, their reputation. Their golden daughter was working at a perfume counter, and their son-in-law was in jail. They had nothing left. "Can we come in, Michaela?" my father asked, finally meeting my eyes. His were watery. "We don't want anything. We just wanted to wish you a Merry Christmas." I looked past them, through the glass walls of my foyer, down to the street below. Parked across the road, just outside the circle of light from my building, was a dusty, old Toyota Camry. And in the driver's seat, I could just make out a silhouette. It was Simone. She was watching, but she didn't dare come up. She knew she wasn't welcome. I looked back at my parents, at my father, twisting his hat, at my mother, clutching her plastic container of cookies like a peace offering. I had won. I had taken their bank, their legacy, their pride. I had proven them wrong in every conceivable way. They weren't here as conquerors. They were here as refugees. And as I looked at them, the anger that had fueled me for 2 years, the sharp, cold rage, it just dissolved. It wasn't satisfaction. It was just quiet. They were no longer the giants who had cast me out. They were just two old, sad people standing in a hallway, holding cookies. I didn't need to be cruel anymore. I had nothing left to prove. "It's cold out here," I said, my voice softer than I expected. I stepped back, holding the heavy door open. "Come in." My father looked up, his eyes wide with a surprise he couldn't hide. My mother let out a small, shaky breath. They stepped slowly, hesitantly, into the foyer, as if walking into a foreign country. Their eyes darted everywhere, taking in the warmth, the laughter from the other room, the modern art. This wasn't the cold, sterile, competitive world they had built. This was a home. Guests from the party, seeing the open door, began to drift over. Jasmine, my scholarship student, smiled warmly at them. Dr. Vance, however, stood back, his arms crossed, his expression a mask of cold judgment, ready to intervene. I took the container of cookies from my mother's hand. "Oatmeal raisin," I said. "Thank you. I'll put these out." I turned to my father. "Dad, there's a bar over there. Can you grab a glass of champagne for yourself and Mom?" He looked stunned to be given a task. "Yes, Of course. Thank you, Michaela. Then I turned to my mother, who was just standing awkwardly, a ghost at the edge of my party. I gave her a small, brief smile, the first one in years. Mom, I said, gesturing toward the open kitchen where my caterers were working. Could you? Could you actually come help me in the kitchen? I need another set of hands to arrange these cookies. It was a complete, total reversal of our old roles. I wasn't the help, she was. But it wasn't a punishment. It was an invitation. My mother stared at me, her eyes filling with tears. She didn't say anything. She just nodded, her chin trembling, and followed me toward the kitchen, leaving my father to navigate a room full of people who represented his daughter's incredible, undeniable success. I was in the kitchen, arranging my mother's lumpy, imperfect cookies on a beautiful silver platter, when I looked out the window. Down on the street, the Toyota Camry was still parked in the shadows. Simone was still in there, alone. She hadn't moved. My father was talking to Dr. Vance, looking awkward but engaged. My mother was actually helping, quietly arranging appetizers. The party was moving on without a second thought about the woman sitting in the cold car. I took a small, elegant plate from the stack, added a few appetizers, a slice of cake, and two of my mother's cookies. I grabbed a cloth napkin and a bottle of sparkling water. Without saying anything to anyone, I left the party, took the elevator back down to the lobby, and walked out the front door of my building. The night air was cold. I walked across the street, my heels clicking on the pavement. She didn't see me coming until I was right at her window. I tapped gently on the glass. Simone flinched, looking up in terror. When she saw it was me, her expression turned to one of profound, bottomless shame. She couldn't even meet my eyes. She just stared at her lap. I didn't try to open the door. I just waited. Finally, she slowly, mechanically, rolled down the window, just a few inches. The smell of stale coffee and something like defeat drifted out. I, she stammered. I just wanted to see. Eat something, Simone, I said. It wasn't a question or a request. I held out the plate. She just stared at it. It's not $40 pizza, I said, my voice not unkind, just factual. It's real food. Eat. That's what broke her. It wasn't the humiliation in the boardroom. It wasn't losing the money. It was this small act of decency. A sob tore out of her, a raw, ugly sound that had nothing to do with the polished, perfect sister I had known. I'm sorry, she wept, her shoulders shaking. Michaela, I'm so sorry. I was just so jealous. Always. You were always smart. You were good. And I wasn't. I'm so sorry. I didn't say, it's okay. I didn't say, I forgive you. I didn't say anything. I balanced the plate and the bottle of water on the roof of her car. Then I turned around and walked back to my party, back to the warmth and the light. Forgiveness is a long, complicated process. It doesn't happen in a single moment on a cold street. But in that moment, as I walked away, I wasn't the babysitter, and she wasn't the golden child. We were just two women, and I was the one who was free. I walked back into the warmth of my party, closing the door softly on the cold night air and the scene in the driveway. The jazz music swelled, and a fresh wave of laughter came from the living room. I felt a sense of peace settle over me. It was done. Dr. Vance was standing near the fireplace, watching me as I re-entered. He had seen me leave with the plate, had seen me return empty-handed. He didn't ask any questions. He just raised his glass of champagne in a silent toast. To Isaiah Franklin's legacy, he said, his voice just loud enough for me to hear over the music. I smiled, raising my own glass in return. To Isaiah's legacy. I looked across my apartment. It was a scene I never could have imagined. In one corner, my father, Marcus, was standing awkwardly, talking to Jasmine, the young student from my old college. He looked stiff, out of place, but he was listening. My mother, Denise, was nearby, offering her plate of homemade cookies to a group of my developers who were accepting them with genuine smiles. They were in my world now, orbits in my solar system, no longer the sun I was forced to revolve around. Then my gaze went to the massive window. 50 floors down, I could just make out the shape of that old Toyota Camry, still parked in the shadows. And inside, I knew my sister Simone was sitting alone, eating cake from a paper plate in the dark. I realized then that my grandfather had given me so much more than $5 million and a bank. He had given me more than just the means for revenge. He had given me the power to break a toxic cycle. My family's legacy, as defined by my parents, had been about appearances, about control, about who had the power to punish. My grandfather's true legacy, the one he had secretly passed to me, was about capability, about innovation, and, I now realized, about compassion. I had the power to destroy them completely, to press those federal charges, to let Simone starve. But I hadn't. I had built something new. I had created a legacy where success was used to lift others up, like Jasmine, not to push them down, like my family had done to me. I had created a legacy of integrity and capability, not arrogance and entitlement. That was the real victory. A few months later, the Beacon Community Bank was fully operational. The grand reopening was the biggest business event Atlanta had seen all year. The mayor attended, the one whose gala my family had chosen over me. This time, I was the guest of honor. But the final scene for me happened a week after that. The party was over. The press was gone. It was late, almost midnight. I was walking through the main lobby of the bank, the lights dimmed low. It was quiet, just the soft hum of the servers. I stopped in the center of the atrium, right under the skylight I had insisted on installing. And I looked up at the wall. There, where a gaudy, oversized portrait of my father used to hang, was a new painting. It was a massive, beautiful portrait of my grandfather, Isaiah Franklin. It was painted from an old black and white photo Dr. Vance had given me, one from the 1960s, when he was young, hungry, and just starting to build his first business. He looked proud. He looked capable. He looked, I realized, a lot like I felt. I stood there for a long time, just looking at his face. I thought about the journey of the last 2 years. I thought about the girl crying on the bus, clutching her laptop. I thought about the arrogant, terrified family in my boardroom. I thought about Simone, who I heard was struggling to make her sales quota at the perfume counter. I thought about Chad, who was cleaning graffiti off underpasses, his community service. And I thought about my parents, living in their small condo, their entire world shrunk to the size of their own failure. I had won. I had gotten my revenge. But standing there, in the silent, powerful building I had reclaimed, I realized it wasn't revenge I felt. It was something heavier and cleaner. It was success. It was proof. My family had been so obsessed with their narrative, so desperate to believe I was the failure, the dropout, the ungrateful child. They needed me to be small so they could feel big. They never stopped to consider that I was the only one who had actually been listening to my grandfather. They saw his legacy as a pile of money, a name on a building, a social ranking to be defended. They saw it as an inheritance to be taken. Isaiah's legacy was never about that. It was about building. It was about seeing a need and filling it. It was about innovation, integrity, and the quiet, unshakable confidence of capability. They had dismissed me, the babysitter, the girl in the hoodie, the community college student. But I was the one who understood. I was the one who saw the future, while they were desperately clinging to a past that was already dead. I had proven that the dropout they mocked was the only true heir to Isaiah Franklin's vision. I reached out and lightly touched the brass plaque beneath the portrait. Isaiah Franklin, founder. I finally understood the peace I felt. It wasn't the satisfaction of seeing my enemies crushed. It was the deep, profound calm of knowing, finally, exactly who I was. I was not my mother's disappointment. I was not my father's failure. I was not my sister's inferior. I was my grandfather's legacy. I smiled. A real, genuine smile. Not for a camera, not for a party, not for anyone but myself. I turned away from the portrait, my heels clicking on the new marble floor, and walked toward the glass doors, looking out at the city lights. I was confident, I was at peace, and I was ready for the future. The most powerful lesson from this story is that your self-worth should never be determined by your family's inability to see it. Michaela was dismissed as a dropout and babysitter by a family obsessed with superficial status. But she held on to her true potential, which her grandfather had recognized. While her family's legacy crumbled from arrogance and corruption, Michaela built her own legacy based on capability, innovation, and integrity. True strength isn't about the power you inherit, it's about the resilience you build when you are underestimated, proving that those who are ignored are often the ones to watch. Have you ever had to choose between your family's expectations and your own future? Share your story of resilience in the comments below.